the shadowed corridors of history. Certain moments do not announce themselves with the crash of armies or the roar of fire. They begin instead with a single, almost imperceptible fracture, a quiet shift in the balance of forces that no one recognizes as the opening of an irreversible chain. One decision, one failure, one overlooked pressure sets the first link in motion, and from that point forward the sequence tightens, each consequence feeding the next, until the entire structure can no longer hold. What follows is not chaos in the sudden sense, but a slow, methodical unraveling, a process in which every attempt at repair only accelerates the descent. The air grows heavier. The ordinary rhythms of life continue for a time, masking the truth that the chain has already begun to pull. By the time the first visible link snaps, the rest are already straining beyond recovery. Across the vast territories once bound by a single imperial order, the daily world still appeared intact. Markets opened at dawn with the same calls of merchants, the same clatter of carts over stone. Farmers rose before light to tend fields that had fed generations. Soldiers marched in formation along roads engineered for permanence. In the cities, aqueducts delivered water with mechanical reliability, and the forums echoed with debates that assumed the system would endure. Children played in courtyards, while their parents spoke of distant borders as if they were fixed and eternal. The scent of baking bread mixed with the smoke of household fires. Evening brought the soft glow of oil lamps, and the murmur of households settling into routine. Nothing in these familiar sounds suggested that the foundations beneath them had already begun to weaken. The collapse did not begin with chaos, it began quietly, in the spaces between ordinary days. Yet beneath that surface of continuity, pressures had been accumulating for decades. Harvests that once arrived with predictable abundance now failed more frequently, the soil exhausted by relentless demand. Trade routes that carried grain and metal grew longer and more fragile, dependent on distant partners whose own stability was eroding. Tax burdens climbed to sustain an army stretched across frontiers that no longer felt secure. Officials in provincial centers filed reports of unrest that were read, noted, and set aside. The warnings arrived not as alarms but as administrative details, numbers on parchment that failed to convey the human weight behind them. A failed harvest in one region forced grain shipments from another, depleting reserves already strained. A border skirmish required reinforcements, drawing men from cities that could ill afford their absence. Each adjustment seemed reasonable in isolation. No one understood what was coming next. The first visible cracks appeared in the movement of people. Families began to leave exhausted lands, seeking food or safety in places that still seemed stable. Roads that had once carried commerce now carried refugees whose numbers increased with every season. In the cities, the influx strained granaries and housing. Prices rose, tempers shortened. The old certainty that the center would provide began to fray. Soldiers returning from distant postings brought stories of abandoned forts and unpaid wages. Merchants spoke of routes no longer safe to travel. The silence between these accounts grew heavier, filled with questions no one dared ask aloud. By the time the signs became clear, the chain was already lengthening, each new pressure locking into the one before it. Decisions made in the name of preservation only tightened the links. Authorities raised taxes further to fund defenses, driving more farmers from the land, and reducing the very production the taxes were meant to protect. Alliances were formed with groups once considered outside the order, bringing short-term military relief at the cost of long-term cohesion. Coinage was debased to meet immediate shortfalls, eroding trust in the medium of exchange itself. Each measure addressed a single crisis while intensifying the next. The administrative machinery continued to function, issuing edicts and collecting what it could, yet the responses no longer matched the scale of the forces in motion. The system still spoke in the language of control, even as control slipped further from its grasp. Then the failures began to cascade. A major grain shipment failed to arrive, not from enemy action but from the collapse of the network that moved it. Cities that had relied on distant supply found their stores emptying. Riots broke out not from ideology but from hunger. The army, unpaid and undersupplied, fractured into factions more loyal to local commanders than to any distant authority. Orders issued from the center arrived too late, or not at all. In the provinces, local elites began to act independently, securing their own territories while the larger structure dissolved around them. The air itself seemed to change. carrying the smoke of burned storehouses and the low sound of crowds moving without direction. What had been a sequence of manageable stresses became a single accelerating process. Inside the cities, the transformation was visceral. Streets that once bustled with commerce fell quiet, except for the sound of hurried footsteps and the occasional crash of looted doors. Families that had lived for generations in the same quarter packed what they could carry and joined the streams of people leaving. Public baths closed. Temples that had stood as anchors of routine saw fewer offerings and more desperate prayers. Children who had known only the old order learned new rules of survival in the space of seasons. The smell of decay replaced the ordinary sense of market and kitchen. Night brought not the soft light of lamps, but the darker glow of fires that no one controlled. The social fabric, once held by shared expectation and institutional presence, tore in places that could not be mended. Beyond the urban centers, the countryside shifted into a different kind of silence. Fields lay fallow not from lack of will, but from the absence of the systems that had coordinated labor and protection. Villages fortified themselves or disappeared. Roads that had connected the empire became corridors of risk rather than arteries of life. Knowledge once preserved in administrative records and scholarly centers began to scatter. Techniques of construction, of agriculture, of governance that had been refined over centuries faced the prospect of interruption. The chain reaction had moved past the point where any single intervention could reverse it. Each broken link made the next break more certain. The human cost accumulated without spectacle. Entire communities dissolved into smaller, more isolated units. Trust once extended across vast distances through the medium of law and coin contracted to the circle of those who could be seen and known. Orphans wandered between groups that could barely feed their own. The old and the sick were left behind more often. Stories of the previous order began to sound like legends rather than recent memory. Survivors adapted to scarcity with a pragmatism that left little room for the ideals that had once animated public life. The process of collapse revealed itself not as a single catastrophic day, but as a continuous erosion of the conditions that made complex society possible. In the years that followed, the fragments of the old structure settled into new patterns. Local powers rose from the ruins, some claiming continuity with what had been lost, others rejecting it entirely. Trade networks reformed on smaller scales. Writing and technical knowledge survived in pockets, preserved by those who still valued them, yet the broader circulation of ideas slowed dramatically. The memory of the interconnected system that had once spanned continents became a cautionary inheritance, spoken of with a mixture of awe and residual fear. The irreversible nature of the chain reaction was now visible in the landscape itself. Abandoned roads, empty forums, fields returning to scrub. The long-term consequences reshaped the possibilities of the centuries ahead. Political authority fragmented into competing centers, each defending narrower territories with fewer resources. Economic complexity declined, measured in the reduced variety of goods, the shorter reach of markets, the simpler tools that replaced more specialized ones. Cultural production contracted. The confidence that large-scale coordination could be sustained without constant crisis gave way to a more guarded view of power and interdependence. What had been lost was not only territory or treasure, but a particular density of connection that would take generations to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. Looking back across the sequence, the pattern emerges with chilling clarity. No single event caused the end. No single decision sealed the fate. Instead, a series of pressures, each manageable in isolation, locked into one another until the combined force exceeded every capacity for response. The early warnings were present in the data of harvests, in the movement of people, in the strain on institutions. They were simply not recognized as the first movements of a chain that, once set in motion, could not be stopped. The ordinary world continued its routines until the routines themselves became impossible. In the final accounting, the irreversible chain reaction leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves an altered understanding of how fragile the arrangements of civilization truly are. The aqueducts that once delivered water stand dry. The roads that once carried legions lie broken. The forums that once held debate fall silent under new growth. And in that silence rests the knowledge that the process began long before anyone named it, in the quiet accumulation of stresses that no one believed could combine into something final. The chain has completed its work. What remains is the long shadow of what can no longer be restored.